Welcome to Truth Behind History. Here is the uncomfortable truth most people do not like to hear. Sovereign default is not some freak event that happens once in a lifetime when a country suddenly goes crazy. It is a recurring feature of how states finance themselves, and history keeps repeating that lesson with different costumes. By the end of this video, you will have a clear way to think about why nations default across centuries, what pressures tend to pile up before it happens, and why the same kinds of breakdowns reappear even when leaders swear they have learned from the past. On this slide, I want you to zoom out so far that the modern headlines start to look less mysterious. Across history, states borrow when they need large resources up front, often for war, for survival, for political promises, and sometimes for infrastructure or reconstruction. Borrowing lets a government pull future revenue into the present, which can be rational, and sometimes it is genuinely productive. But the same tool also creates a temptation. It is easier to commit future taxpayers than to ask today's voters for immediate sacrifice. And that tension is ancient. The record, going back through empires and into modern nation-states, shows defaults arriving in clusters, not as isolated flukes. That clustering matters because it hints at system forces, not just personal mistakes. When a global shock hits, when trade collapses, when war spending explodes, when a commodity price falls, or when political legitimacy breaks, debt that looked manageable can suddenly become fragile. And fragility is not just about the amount owed. It is about confidence, about timing, about whether lenders believe they will be repaid without having to fight for it, and about whether a society will tolerate the taxes or spending cuts required to keep the promise. Another pattern you should notice is that default rarely travels alone. It tends to show up alongside currency turmoil, inflation pressures, banking stress, and sudden shifts in geopolitical conditions, because the state, the financial system, and the currency regime are intertwined. Think of sovereign debt like a bridge between politics and economics. It is a financial contract, but it is also a political promise made under uncertainty. On the timeline and map we are using here, the point is not to memorize every episode. The point is to see repetition. If you spot repetition, you stop treating each crisis as a moral drama with a single villain, and you start asking the more interesting question: what incentives, what constraints, and what shocks make default a predictable outcome for governments in certain positions? Hold on to that mindset, because once you see default as a recurring pattern of state finance, you can begin to analyze it with clarity instead of surprise. When most people hear the word default, they imagine one dramatic moment: a government announces it will not pay, creditors panic, and the story ends. But in real history, default is usually not a single switch that flips from good to bad. It is a spectrum of ways a state changes the deal after borrowing, and that spectrum matters because it shapes who actually bears the cost. At the most obvious end, you have missed payments, where interest or principal simply does not get paid on schedule. But there are quieter forms that can be just as consequential. A government can extend maturities, meaning it pushes repayment further into the future. It can reduce coupons, meaning it lowers the interest it pays. It can restructure, meaning it renegotiates the overall terms, often under pressure, sometimes through formal exchanges of old bonds for new ones. And then there are the methods that do not always get labeled default in casual conversation, but can still function like broken promises in practice. Inflation can erode the real value of what creditors are repaid, especially when debt is in domestic currency. Policy can force conversions or channel domestic savings into government debt through regulations, which shifts the burden onto citizens and institutions at home. Capital controls can trap money inside a country, changing what people can do with their assets and effectively rewriting the economic environment around repayment. So rather than asking only did they default or not, a better question is, how did they make the adjustment, and who paid for it? Now let's add a second crucial distinction that changes how you interpret almost every crisis: the difference between liquidity problems and solvency problems. Liquidity is about timing. It is the government equivalent of needing cash today even if, in theory, the long-run resources exist. A country can be stuck because it cannot roll over debt, meaning it cannot borrow again to pay what is coming due, even if the overall economy is large. Solvency is deeper. It means the debt burden is so large relative to the state's capacity to raise revenue that, without major changes, the promise is not believable over time. And notice how political this becomes. A state might technically have the ability to raise taxes, but if the social system cannot sustain that level of extraction without unrest or collapse in legitimacy, the practical capacity is smaller than the theoretical one. Finally, I want you to keep one uncomfortable thought in mind while looking at any default episode. Some defaults happen because a government truly cannot pay without breaking the society, and some happen because it chooses not to pay because the political cost of repayment is higher than the political cost of non-payment. In other words, there is often a cannot story and a will not story competing in the background. If you learn to see default as a range of tools and trade-offs, you stop getting trapped by labels, and you start seeing the actual mechanics of how states shift losses across time, across groups, and across borders. If you want to understand sovereign debt, you have to start with a strange institutional fact that changes everything. There is no normal bankruptcy court for countries. When a corporation cannot pay, there is a legal process, an administrator, and assets that can be seized or reorganized under clear rules. A sovereign state is different. It controls courts at home, it controls taxation at home, and it cannot be easily forced into a standard liquidation process by outsiders. That means repayment is not enforced the way most contracts are enforced. Instead, it is held together by incentives. Why would a country repay if it can, at least in the short run, get relief by not repaying? One answer comes from classic economic thinking about reputation. A government repays today partly because it wants access to borrowing tomorrow, and because being seen as reliable can lower future borrowing costs. If default makes lenders distrust you, you may be locked out of markets or forced to borrow at punishing interest rates, which can hurt growth and government capacity. Another answer focuses on punishment channels that do not require a global court. Creditors can pursue legal strategies in foreign jurisdictions, they can attempt to seize certain assets that travel abroad, and they can create long, messy conflicts that raise the cost of default. Trade and diplomacy can also be affected, not always in a formal way, but through reduced trust, tighter terms, and less willingness to do business. But here is the twist that history makes impossible to ignore. Even with these costs, lending often resumes, sometimes surprisingly quickly, even to repeat defaulters. Why? Because creditors face incentives too. If there is a chance of repayment, partial repayment, or a later restructuring that restores value, investors may still lend, especially when yields are high and optimism returns. This is why some theories emphasize that punishment is limited. A country can sometimes default, suffer, then re-enter markets when conditions change, leadership changes, or global money becomes abundant again. So the big lesson on this slide is not that countries are uniquely immoral, or that creditors are uniquely naive. It is that the enforcement environment is imperfect by design, so sovereign debt becomes a strategic relationship rather than a simple contract. Once you see that, default starts to look less like a shocking violation and more like one possible outcome in a bargaining game shaped by credibility, future access, and the real limits of coercion. War is one of the oldest reasons states borrow, because wars demand huge resources immediately while taxes arrive slowly over time, and that tension puts us right at the heart of sovereign default risk. When a government takes on debt, the real question is not only how large the debt is, it is whether the state has the practical capacity to raise revenue reliably when repayment comes due. Capacity here means administration, legitimacy, and the credibility of the rules. Can the state actually collect taxes without breaking compliance, triggering revolt, or tearing apart the coalition that keeps the government in power? And just as important, do lenders believe the state will follow predictable procedures rather than grabbing resources arbitrarily the moment pressure rises? History suggests that credibility is shaped by institutions that limit discretion. A famous case comes from 17th century England, where scholars like Douglas North and Barry Weingast argue that political and constitutional changes help the state commit more credibly to repayment, in part by strengthening constraints on executive power and giving creditors more confidence that promises would be honored through stable processes. The core idea is simple but powerful. When a government can credibly signal that future taxation and repayment will be handled through rules rather than impulses, borrowing becomes cheaper and more sustainable, because the risk premium demanded by lenders falls. But if that credibility is weak, the opposite happens. Interest costs rise, borrowing becomes short-term and fragile, and the state is tempted to rely on emergency measures that may solve today's problem while damaging tomorrow's trust. This is where war finance becomes a revealing stress test. War raises spending fast, which pushes governments toward debt, and then the pressure to service that debt exposes what the state truly is. A set of institutions that can either extract resources within accepted limits or reach for coercive shortcuts that undermine legitimacy. And that brings a moral question that history keeps placing on the table whether we like it or not. When the state borrows in the name of survival or national glory, who is actually consenting, and who is being obligated later? On this slide, the takeaway is that default risk is not just a market phenomenon, it is an institutional one. The ability to tax, the ability to restrain arbitrary power, and the ability to maintain legitimacy under stress all shape whether sovereign promises remain believable when the bill comes due. Money is not just a neutral measuring stick in these stories. The money regime is part of the machinery that determines how a sovereign debt crisis can unfold, and sometimes it determines which groups absorb the shock. Start with a simple question: what currency is the debt denominated in? If a government borrows in its own domestic currency, it has one option available that is not available when it borrows in a foreign currency. It can try to reduce the real burden of repayment through inflation. That does not make inflation painless or morally clean, and it does not mean it is always chosen, but it is a real escape valve in the menu of crisis responses. Now flip the situation. If the debt is denominated in a foreign currency, or governed by foreign law, that escape valve largely disappears. The promise becomes harder in one sense, because the state cannot simply change the purchasing power of the repayment unit at home. But the promise also becomes more fragile, because the country's revenues and tax base are usually tied to the domestic economy and domestic currency. If the exchange rate moves sharply, the real burden of servicing foreign currency debt can rise quickly, even if nothing about the underlying productive capacity changed overnight. This is where the idea often called original sin comes in, the tendency for some countries to face limits on borrowing internationally in their own currency, which exposes them to currency mismatch risk. And now we add the regime layer. Under a gold standard, or a hard fixed peg, or inside a monetary union, the government faces constraints that can make adjustment more rigid. The state cannot freely devalue or expand the money supply to ease short-run pressures, so the adjustment may shift toward taxes, spending cuts, wage and price changes, or formal restructuring. Under a domestic fiat regime, the flexibility is greater, but that flexibility also changes incentives, because it can tempt leaders to solve fiscal problems through monetary means that redistribute costs in ways that are less visible at first. The takeaway for this slide is that sovereign debt is never just about debt. It is also about the monetary architecture that surrounds the debt, because that architecture shapes the choice set, and the choice set shapes who pays, how quickly they pay, and whether the society sees the adjustment as legitimate or as a betrayal hidden inside the currency itself. Let's get very honest about what a sovereign default really is in practice. It is not just a technical failure to pay, it is a decision about who will absorb losses when the numbers stop adding up. Every path out of a debt crisis redistributes pain. If a government raises taxes, one set of people pays. If it cuts spending, another set pays. If it inflates away part of the burden, savers and wage earners often feel it in a different way. If it restructures, creditors take a hit, but then you have to ask which creditors: foreign investors, domestic banks, pension funds, or ordinary citizens whose retirement accounts are tied to government bonds. So on this slide, the key idea is that default is a distributive conflict. It is a fight over where the loss will land, and that fight is shaped by political incentives. Governments often operate on short-time horizons. Election cycles, coalition stability, and the daily pressure to avoid immediate unrest can push leaders toward choices that postpone costs rather than settle them cleanly. Rolling over debt, borrowing more to cover what is due, or using subtle financial tools can feel easier than asking the public for visible sacrifice today. But postponement has a habit of compounding, because delayed adjustment can weaken credibility, and weakened credibility can raise borrowing costs, which then makes the whole burden heavier. This is where the ethical question on this slide matters, and it is not ideology, it is basic accountability. When a state borrows, who truly consented to that obligation, and who is forced to carry it later? A newborn citizen never signed the bond contract, yet may inherit the tax burden. A worker may have no influence over borrowing decisions, yet may bear the consequences through austerity, inflation, or unemployment during adjustment. Even the language we use can hide this reality. We say the country owes, but countries do not feel pain, people do. And once you frame it that way, you start to see why default debates become so emotionally charged. They are not only arguments about spreadsheets. They are arguments about fairness, responsibility, and power. The point of this slide is to train your eyes to look for the distribution behind the policy, because in sovereign debt, the most important question is often not can they pay, but who will be made to pay, and by what mechanism. Many sovereign defaults feel like they are caused entirely by domestic mistakes, and yes, domestic policy matters, but history shows a repeating external pattern that can turn vulnerability into crisis very fast. Global credit conditions change, and suddenly the money that was easy to borrow becomes expensive or disappears. Think of it like a tide. When global liquidity is abundant, investors search for yield, capital flows outward, and borrowing becomes easier for many governments at the same time. That can encourage optimism, and optimism can encourage risk-taking on both sides. Governments may expand spending or lean on short-term refinancing because markets seem welcoming. Lenders may become less cautious because recent returns look strong and the fear of default feels distant. Then the tide turns. Global interest rates rise, or risk appetite collapses, or a major financial shock makes investors pull back, and countries that depended on rolling over debt face a sudden stop. A sudden stop is exactly what it sounds like: inflows that once felt steady slow sharply or reverse, and the government is forced to confront its financing needs in a much harsher environment. This is one reason defaults often come in waves. It is not that multiple countries suddenly become irresponsible on the same day. It is that a shared external constraint tightens, and the same stress test gets applied across many balance sheets at once. And notice the cause and effect logic here. When external financing dries up, borrowing costs rise, which makes refinancing harder, which creates anxiety, which can further reduce lender willingness, which pushes the country toward emergency measures. Even a government with decent long-run prospects can be pushed into crisis mode if its short-run refinancing needs are large and confidence falls quickly. The big takeaway on this slide is humility. To understand default risk, you cannot look only inward at a country's policies, you also have to look outward at the global environment that shapes the cost and availability of credit. Sovereign debt lives inside an international system, and when that system shifts, the ripple effects can be swift, synchronized, and unforgiving. This slide is where the whole story starts to feel almost mechanical, because you can watch a default emerge not just from bad fundamentals, but from a run in confidence. Here is the idea: a government can reach a point where it is not immediately out of money, but it is dependent on refinancing, meaning it needs to borrow again to pay what is coming due. If investors believe refinancing will be smooth, they lend at reasonable rates, the government rolls over its obligations, and the system continues. But if investors begin to doubt repayment, even slightly, they demand higher interest, or they shorten maturities, or they step back entirely. That response makes refinancing harder, which makes the doubt look justified, which creates more doubt. Economists like Harold Cole and Timothy Kehoe have explored how these self-reinforcing expectations can generate a crisis that is, in a sense, self-fulfilling. Notice the logic. The fear of default can raise borrowing costs, and higher borrowing costs can push the debt burden into a dangerous trajectory, even if the underlying economy did not suddenly collapse. That is why debt dynamics matter. Over time, what happens depends on the relationship between the interest rate the government must pay and the growth of the economy that supports the tax base. If the interest burden rises faster than the economy and revenue capacity, the debt load can snowball. Then the government faces the hard requirement of running a primary surplus, meaning it needs to collect more in revenue than it spends before interest, just to stabilize the situation. But credibility determines whether that adjustment is believed. If markets think the politics will not sustain it, they price that in immediately, and maturity structure quietly sits underneath all of this like a trapdoor. If much of the debt comes due soon, the government is exposed to rollover risk, because it must keep convincing lenders again and again on a short schedule. So the lesson of this slide is that default is not always a slow moral decline followed by a dramatic collapse. Sometimes it is a coordination failure around refinancing, where beliefs about the future change the interest rate today, and the interest rate today changes what the future becomes. Early modern Europe is a perfect place to break a comforting myth, the myth that once a state defaults, markets will punish it forever and the story is over. What the historical record shows instead is something more unsettling and more informative. Repeated defaults could occur, and lending could still continue, even to serial defaulters. Consider powerful early modern states such as Spain, which financed expansive commitments through borrowing tied closely to war, empire, and the unpredictable timing of revenue. When pressures intensified, payments were suspended or terms were altered, and yet creditors often returned. Why would they do that? Because creditors were not simply trusting a moral promise, they were weighing incentives. High yields can tempt investors back. Political leverage can matter. A creditor might believe that some repayment is better than none, especially if renegotiation is expected and partial recovery is likely. And on the sovereign side, the incentives are equally clear. Borrowing can keep armies in the field, maintain political survival, and postpone painful fiscal choices. In that world, enforcement was not mainly a clean legal mechanism. It was shaped by power, diplomacy, trade relationships, and sometimes the shadow of force. Even when courts played a role, the main bargaining power often came from geopolitical realities, not from a neutral global referee. That is why this period is so useful. It reveals sovereign debt as a relationship embedded in political hierarchy and coercive capacity, not simply in paperwork. And it raises a moral question that cannot be avoided if we are intellectually honest. If repayment depends partly on power, and if the costs of borrowing and default are shifted onto populations who never signed the contracts, what exactly is the ethical foundation of these obligations? This slide does not ask you to take a side. It asks you to see the system clearly. Early modern serial defaults were not just failures of character, they were outcomes shaped by incentives, limited enforcement, and the realities of centralized power operating under extreme pressure. Now we move into a modern wave that shows how external conditions and currency choices can trap entire regions, not just single countries. In the 1980s, much of Latin America entered what became known as a lost decade, and the core mechanism is a powerful lesson in how sovereign debt interacts with global interest rates, foreign currency exposure, and domestic political limits. Many governments in the region had accumulated large debts that were difficult to service when global financial conditions tightened. When interest rates rose and global lenders became more cautious, refinancing became far more expensive and sometimes impossible. At the same time, when a country's revenues are largely tied to its domestic economy but its debt obligations are effectively tied to an external unit of account, the real burden can increase sharply as exchange rates shift or as the terms of financing worsen. The result is that what looked manageable during the boom suddenly becomes fragile during the reversal. And once that reversal begins, governments face harsh trade-offs. They can try to cut spending, raise taxes, or negotiate with creditors, but each of those options carries political consequences. If austerity provokes unrest or destabilizes the governing coalition, the adjustment itself becomes harder to sustain. If the banking system is exposed to government debt, restructuring can damage domestic financial stability. And if credibility weakens, markets react in ways that amplify the problem. That is why this episode is so instructive. It shows a debt crisis as a system event. External rates and funding conditions shift. Domestic financing constraints tighten. Political capacity to adjust is tested. And the consequence can be prolonged stagnation, distributional conflict, and cycles of policy instability that make future borrowing more expensive. The key takeaway on this slide is not that the region shared one identical mistake. The takeaway is that shared exposure to global credit conditions and shared vulnerabilities in debt structure can produce synchronized crises, and those crises can shape development outcomes for years, sometimes decades, after the original shock. Argentina's 2001 default is one of the clearest modern examples of how sovereign debt can keep producing conflict long after the initial missed payments, because the real drama often shifts from economics to contract design and legal strategy. After the default, Argentina offered restructuring deals that invited creditors to exchange old bonds for new terms, and many investors accepted because they preferred a negotiated recovery to an extended standoff. But some creditors refused, becoming what are often called holdouts, meaning they insisted on payment under the original terms rather than taking the restructuring offer. That choice set up a high-stakes conflict that was not only about money, but about how bond language should be interpreted and enforced in foreign courts. When disputes like this move into legal systems outside the issuing country, the leverage changes. Questions that sound technical suddenly become decisive, such as how a clause is read, what counts as equal treatment of creditors, and what remedies a court will allow if a sovereign refuses to pay. The result is that default becomes a bargaining war fought with paperwork, injunctions, and enforcement efforts rather than armies or diplomats. This is also where creative restructuring features can matter. Argentina issued gross domestic product-linked warrants, instruments meant to tie payouts to economic performance, basically a way to share upside if growth returns. But even tools like that can spark debate, because they rely on definitions and measurements that must be trusted, and when trust is already damaged, even seemingly clever solutions can create new disputes. The big lesson of this slide is that sovereign default is not a clean reset. It can be the start of a long institutional afterlife where courts, contracts, and strategic behavior shape outcomes for years, and where the line between financial engineering and political power becomes very hard to separate. Greece in 2012 is a powerful case because it shows how joining a monetary union changes the entire menu of options in a debt crisis. If a country controls its own currency, it has one set of tools available, including the possibility of devaluing or allowing higher inflation to ease the real burden of debt that is owed in domestic currency. But inside the euro area, that flexibility is sharply constrained, because monetary policy is shared and the currency cannot be adjusted by one member state on its own. So when pressure builds, the adjustment tends to concentrate into fiscal and political channels, taxes, spending cuts, wage and price pressures, and negotiations over debt terms. In Greece's case, a major element was the restructuring of bonds held by private investors, often described as private sector involvement, where private creditors accepted changes to the terms of repayment as part of a broader effort to restore sustainability. What makes this episode especially instructive is how coordination was handled. Collective action clauses, which are contract provisions that can allow a supermajority of bondholders to agree to restructuring terms that then apply more broadly, played an important role in shaping how negotiations unfolded. The deeper point is not to memorize the legal mechanics, but to see what they reveal about incentives and constraints. In a monetary union, the usual escape routes are narrowed, so the political system faces a more direct confrontation with distribution. Who absorbs the losses when the currency cannot move? How do institutions balance stability for the broader union with hardship in the member state? And how do the rules of the game, including domestic law and bond contract design, shift bargaining power between a government and its creditors? This slide is a reminder that sovereign debt crises are never just about arithmetic. They are about institutional architecture, and in a monetary union, that architecture can reshape both the path of adjustment and the social consequences that come with it. Sovereign debt crises are messy partly because the underlying problem is not only money, it is coordination. When a country needs to restructure, thousands of investors may hold pieces of the debt, each with an incentive to wait for others to accept a haircut while they hold out for full payment. That creates a collective action problem, and the modern sovereign debt world has tried to design contract rules to reduce that chaos. One of the most important tools is the collective action clause, a provision in many bond contracts that allows a qualified majority of creditors to agree to new terms that then become binding for a broader group. The basic logic is straightforward: if enough creditors can vote to accept a restructuring, it becomes harder for a small minority to block a deal that most participants believe is necessary. The International Monetary Fund has written extensively about how these clauses can make restructurings more orderly by reducing the leverage of pure holdout strategies, though the details depend heavily on the exact clause design and how votes are aggregated across different bond series. After high-profile legal battles in the sovereign debt world, market groups responded by updating standard contract language, including newer models promoted by the International Capital Market Association, with the goal of clarifying ambiguous terms and improving how creditors coordinate across multiple bond issues. But contract clauses are only one layer. The legal framework governing what creditors can do when a sovereign refuses to pay also matters, especially rules about sovereign immunity. In the United States, for example, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act sets boundaries on when a foreign state can be sued and what kinds of assets can be targeted, which shapes the real bargaining power in disputes. Put all of this together and you get the big lesson of this slide: the outcomes of sovereign debt crises are shaped not just by economic capacity, but by legal architecture and contract design, because those rules determine how conflict plays out, how quickly coordination is reached, and how predictable the process is for citizens, creditors, and governments alike. What should we take from all this, if we want to be honest, historically grounded, and still brave enough to ask deeper questions? The first takeaway is that sovereign default is not simply about big debt numbers. Across history, default risk emerges from a web of credibility, state capacity, currency structure, and political constraints that interact over time. A government's promise is only as believable as its institutions, its ability to raise revenue without breaking legitimacy, and the confidence that future leaders will follow stable rules rather than improvising under pressure. The second takeaway is about systems and incentives. Centralized interventions can sometimes stabilize a crisis in the short run, but history repeatedly shows that stabilization can come with incentive distortions, moral hazard, delayed adjustment, and policies that shift costs in ways that are not always visible at first. The key is not to treat intervention as automatically evil or automatically wise, but to examine the long-run patterns of unintended outcomes that appear when decision-makers can offload costs onto future citizens, diffuse the burden through inflation, or redesign rules during emergencies. And this leads to the moral questions that history keeps forcing into view. When a sovereign borrows, who truly consents? When repayment strains society, who is compelled to sacrifice? When adjustment occurs through hidden channels, like inflation erosion or financial repression, is the public meaningfully informed, or are choices being made on their behalf without clear accountability? There is also a question of agency. In many narratives, entire populations are treated like passive objects moved by grand policy, yet the historical record is filled with ordinary people adapting, resisting, cooperating, and rebuilding under constraints they did not choose. So here is the invitation I want to leave you with: treat sovereign debt not as a distant technical topic, but as a window into how political and monetary systems distribute power and responsibility over time. If we care about ethical governance, we should care about consent, transparency, and the alignment between those who decide and those who bear the consequences. If we care about economic development, we should care about institutions that create credible commitments and limit destructive cycles of short-termism. If we care about freedom, we should ask what kinds of systems preserve individual agency when crises arrive. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you want more episodes that connect history, economics, and the incentives behind power. And here is my question for you. When a nation borrows in the name of the people, what do you think the people are truly owed in return?